Jenna Pierce didn't consider herself superstitious. As a single mother raising her 8-year-old son, Ethan, she had enough to worry about without believing in ghost stories or haunted dolls. But when Ethan came home from a yard sale with a ragged, grinning doll named Rusty, Jenna couldn't help but feel a chill run down her spine. The doll was unsettling, to say the least. It had faded red hair, scuffed button eyes, and a permanent grin that seemed far too wide for its worn-out fabric face. Its clothes were patched, and one of its shoes was missing, but Ethan was instantly enchanted by it. "Mom, isn't he cool?" Ethan beamed, holding the doll up. "His name is Rusty." Jenna forced a smile. "Yeah, he's something," she said, trying not to show her discomfort. She didn't want to spoil her son's excitement, especially when he'd bought the doll with his own allowance. But there was something about Rusty's eyes, they almost seemed to follow her whenever she walked by. The first few nights with Rusty in the house were uneventful. Jenna convinced herself that her unease was nothing more than her imagination. But then, strange things began happening. It started small, things that could easily be chalked up to forgetfulness. The TV would be on in the middle of the night, even though Jenna was certain she had turned it off before bed. Ethan's toys would be strewn across the living room in the morning, even though she remembered putting them away. One night, as Jenna was tucking Ethan into bed, she noticed that Rusty was no longer sitting on the shelf where Ethan usually kept him. Instead, the doll was propped up on a chair, facing the bed, as if watching her son sleep. "Ethan, did you move Rusty?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "No, Mom," he said, blinking up at her with sleepy eyes. "Rusty likes to move on his own." Jenna's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Ethan shrugged. "Sometimes, when I wake up, he's in different places. He's probably just playing hide and seek." Jenna's skin prickled. "Okay, well, let's keep Rusty on the shelf from now on, all right?" Ethan nodded, but as she turned to leave, she could have sworn she heard a soft, raspy giggle behind her. The nightmare begins that night. Jenna was jolted awake by a loud thump coming from Ethan's room. Panic surged through her as she rushed down the hallway, her heart hammering in her chest. She burst into Ethan's room to find him sitting up in bed, wide-eyed and clutching his blankets. "What happened?" she asked, trying to catch her breath. "It was Rusty," Ethan whispered, pointing toward the corner of the room. The doll was sitting there, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, grinning up at her. Jenna's unease turned to anger. "Ethan, I told you to keep that doll on the shelf," she said, trying to mask her fear. "I didn't move him, Mom," Ethan insisted, tears welling in his eyes. "He did it himself." Jenna took the doll and shoved it back on the shelf, determined to get rid of it in the morning. But as she turned to leave, she could feel Rusty's eyes boring into her back. She slept fitfully that night, plagued by nightmares of the doll's grinning face. The next morning, she was awoken by Ethan's screams. She sprinted to his room, only to find him standing in the doorway, staring at the sight before him. Rusty was sitting on Ethan's bed, surrounded by the shredded remains of his favorite stuffed animals. "Mom, I swear, it wasn't me," Ethan cried, tears streaming down his face. Jenna's patience snapped. "That's it," she shouted, grabbing Rusty. "We're getting rid of this thing." She tossed the doll into the trash bin outside, slamming the lid shut. But even as she walked back into the house, she couldn't shake the feeling that Rusty's grin had grown wider. The return that night, the house was eerily quiet. Jenna checked on Ethan, who was sound asleep, and decided to call it an early night. But just as she was drifting off, she heard it, a soft, scratching sound, like nails on wood. At first, she thought it was a branch tapping against the window, but as she listened, the sound grew louder, more frantic. It was coming from inside the house. Her heart in her throat, Jenna grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made her way down the hallway. The sound was coming from the kitchen. As she turned the corner, her blood ran cold. There, on the kitchen counter, sat Rusty, his button eyes gleaming in the flashlight's beam. His fabric hands were clawing at the counter, leaving deep scratch marks. "How did you get back in here?" Jenna whispered, her voice barely audible. She backed away, her mind racing. She had thrown the doll away. How could it possibly be here? Rusty's head slowly turned to face her, and for the first time, she swore she saw the doll blink. Its wide grin seemed to stretch even further, revealing tiny, jagged teeth that hadn't been there before. Jenna screamed and grabbed a knife from the counter, slashing at the doll. But Rusty was fast, far too fast for something made of cloth and stuffing. It leaped from the counter, its tiny hands latching onto her wrist with surprising strength. She flung the doll across the room, watching in horror as it scrambled to its feet, its grin never faltering. Rusty lunged at her, and she swung the knife wildly, managing to sever one of its arms. The doll let out an ear-piercing shriek, like nails on a chalkboard, before scuttling away into the shadows. Breathing heavily, Jenna grabbed the dismembered arm and sprinted to Ethan's room. "Ethan, wake up, we're leaving," she shouted, shaking him awake. "What's going on, Mom?" he asked, rubbing his eyes. "No time to explain," she said, dragging him out of bed. As they reached the front door, Rusty appeared at the top of the stairs, its one remaining arm outstretched, its grin now twisted into a snarl. "Go, go, go," Jenna screamed, pushing Ethan out the door. They raced to the car, Jenna fumbling with the keys as Rusty's tiny footsteps grew louder behind them. Just as the doll leapt toward them, Jenna managed to start the car and peel out of the driveway. The final confrontation, they drove to the nearest motel, refusing to go back to the house. But as Jenna sat in the motel room, clutching Ethan close, she knew they weren't safe. Rusty would find them. It was only a matter of time. Determined to end it once and for all, she did some research and discovered that the yard sale where Ethan had bought Rusty was from the estate of a deceased toymaker rumored to have dabbled in black magic. The doll was said to be cursed, created to trap the souls of its victims. Jenna knew what she had to do. She drove back to the house, armed with matches and lighter fluid. She found Rusty waiting for her in the living room, its grin wider than ever. Without hesitation, she doused the doll in lighter fluid and set it ablaze. Rusty's screams echoed through the house as it wreathed in the flames, its button eyes melting into black puddles. But Jenna didn't stop until there was nothing left but ashes. Breathing a sigh of relief, she collapsed to the floor, exhausted but triumphant. It was finally over, or so she thought. As she turned to leave, her phone buzzed with a new message. "You can't get rid of me that easily. I'm coming back. And I'm bringing friends." Jenna dropped the phone, her heart sinking. The nightmare was far from over.